Good afternoon. My name is Honor Feedy, and I'm with the National Association of Elementary School Principals. I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar on School Culture Rewired with Steve Grunert. We're so happy this afternoon to have Steve join us to share his expertise in school culture. Steve is the professor at Indiana State University. He has studied organizational culture and climate for more than 20 years and continues to learn and collaborate with other researchers as these concepts evolve. Steve is the co-author of School Culture Rewired, How to Define, Assess, and Transform It, and also another book entitled Minds Unleashed, How Principals Can Lead the Right-Brained Way. His wife and he work at Indiana State University, and they have three lovely daughters, Jennifer, Mackenzie, and Madison. So Steve, welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to get started.
Thank you very much. I've been a fan of school culture for many, many years. I actually started studying this in 1996, and I can't seem to leave it alone. So. What I'm going to share with today is based on my research. It's based on my observations as I do consulting with schools, as I attend conferences and listen to other people talk. So it's really an accumulation of everything that I know so far. And I like to just keep reading about it. And every time I make a presentation, it's the latest stuff I know.
Great.
So what we'll do today is I will spend probably the better part of an hour, maybe 45 minutes, going through some slides talking about some of this stuff. And at the end, we'll have some time for some questions if anybody has any questions. What I'll do here on the first slide, first I want to talk about the connection between school culture and student achievement. The slide, you can see it's not a straight line. That's a squiggly red line. That just simply means that there's a lot of noise in between, a lot of variables, a lot of factors in between. So if you're trying to actually measure the connection through research or for whatever reason between school culture and student achievement, you're going to find that there's a lot of intervening variables in between. But basically, the school culture determines who can talk to whom in your building. I know that sounds weird because we're all adults and we should be able to walk up to anybody and talk to anybody just about anything. But as we learn more about school culture, we find that certain people, certain teachers, certain adults in the building may not have permission to talk about certain subjects with other adults in the building. Otherwise, if they do, they risk losing their membership in the club. And membership in the club is just another metaphor for just being a part of that culture. So the connection between school culture and student achievement is really about efficacy, which is a fancy word for self-confidence. We know that a teacher who has self-confidence, who thinks they're doing a good job, probably is and probably will be. And when the teacher thinks they're doing a good job, a student will probably do a good job. And then that leads to student efficacy. If a student thinks they're doing well, thinks they can do well, if they have confidence, that usually comes from the teacher. And that teacher, the degree of efficacy they hold, usually comes from the people they hang around with in school, their friends, their professional peers. Those 3 or 4 or 5 people that they hang around with in the hallways, during lunch, in the parking lots, maybe on weekends, those are the people that influence their behavior more than anyone else. So and we'll find that later as I begin to share with some stories that can really impact behaviors. They need to come from your friends, not the leadership. So let's just see what happens here. As we look at the connection between school culture and student achievement, it is all about efficacy, and efficacy comes from our friends. And really, school culture will tell you who your friends are. But let's move on. Where do school cultures come from? Well, The slide here tells us that no one person can make a culture. And anytime a group of people spend a significant period of time together, well, they probably have something in common, and they will develop roles and expectations for each other. I have a significant period of time in red for a reason. My co-author, Todd Whitaker, and I have written 2 books now on school culture, and the first one took us practically 7 years to write because there are some things that we just don't agree on. And I think that sometimes really cool books come when your co-authors don't really agree on everything. In other words, a significant period of time is something the 2 of us are not really in agreement on, and that's fine. He's one of my best friends, and I respect him so much, but he's pretty sure you can change a culture pretty fast, and I'm pretty sure it takes a long time. So if you want to create a culture, it's probably going to take a few years. Now, between that time, you can get some things done. There is something happening. People are coming together. There is cohesiveness. There is bonding occurring. But it's not quite yet a culture, if you will. It's something, but it's not a culture. A culture is really, really something strong. And if you want to create one, it'll take a couple years. If you want to change one that already exists, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 years. And again, you don't have to wait 3 to 5 years. And that's not the point. The point is you can start tomorrow, but you're going to have to really be intentional about it and have a long-term plan and plan on it taking 3 to 5 years. Over time, these roles will develop and define each person and give balance to the group. This balance thing is in red because I find it very fascinating. It seems as though organizational culture or school cultures need this balance, like this ecological system, if you will, that if you do have some weak teachers, it's quite possible that your culture has convinced the organization it needs some weak teachers. Let me explain that. I imagine that there are many principals out there who secretly say under their breath, man, I wish I could just get rid of 2 or 3 of these teachers here. They're driving us nuts. They're not really doing well. They're very negative. They're just not productive. They're pushing back all the time. We could do so much better without these 2 or 3 teachers. Well, my question would be to them is if I'd ask them, did you hire them that way? Now, if you did, then your human resources has an issue. But chances are you hired some pretty good people, at least potentially. At the interview, they were probably under the impression that they could be one of your best teachers, and you thought so too, or you probably wouldn't have hired them. So here we have a couple of people you just hired. They want to be your best. You want them to be your best, and something happened. And now you're ready to get rid of them. Well, let's say you can get rid of them. Let's go ahead and terminate these people for whatever reason. They're gone. Now you get to hire 2 new teachers. My question then is it possible these 2 new teachers might get the same classroom, same schedule, same lunch break, same committee meetings, same hallway with the same people in it, interacting at the same time of the days? In other words, could we accidentally push these people into the mold that was created by the weak teachers? Because your school's culture is based on the collective personalities of everybody in the building. And if they've been there a long time, then that's your comfort zone. That's where your culture is comfortable. with the people who are in it right now, good or bad, and if there are a few in there who are ineffective, it still helps define your culture. The group will create unwritten rules, or we call these norms, to regulate how they relate to each other. The word relationship is coming more and more into the conversation of how effective teachers work with students. And for that matter, how effective teachers work with other teachers and how leaders work with teachers. It's all about the relationships. Well, again, it's the culture that determines who can relate to who. It manages these relationships. Rewards and sanctions will support the rules, usually in a form of peer pressure. That peer pressure stuff is that stuff we felt in middle school. That 7th and 8th grade need to be cool, the need just to look normal, to fit into some kind of a crowd. Well, as adults, it's still there. So yes, culture can be considered a form of a peer pressure. Let's move on. How do we know it is part of the culture? Again, I'm trying to help people to understand a little bit about culture that you might not have realized. And a lot of people, very intelligent people, good-minded educators, will say, wow, this is part of the culture. That's part of the culture. My challenge to them is that if you think something is part of the culture, don't do it one time. See who cares. My favorite example is with PLCs, professional learning communities. I have found that many school leaders believe those are the answers to a lot of problems. Well, they're not the answers. They're the means to getting to a better solution. But if PLCs are truly valued and people believe they make a difference, I challenge you one week to just make up a reason and just tell folks we're not meeting in PLCs this week. And see who cares. See what the reaction is. See who's happy. See who's not. See who meets anyways. Because if your folks are still getting together, even after you have suggested or asked them or even told them not to meet one time, if they still get together, then you know it's part of the culture, it's valuable, and people believe it works. Another piece of how do we know it's part of the culture is that it simply makes you feel normal and safe. You just don't notice it anymore. Next slide, something you might not have realized is culture strength. Too often we find people equating a strong culture with a good culture. And really a strong culture is just one where everybody's on the same page. They're tight. There's strong cohesiveness and there's bonding. They've got each other's back. The interesting part is that it could still be a negative culture. You can have a negative, strong culture, one that is difficult to change. And the weak cultures aren't necessarily the bad cultures. It just means people are not bonding. They are not cohesive. They just come to work, go to their classroom, shut the door, maybe say hi to a few folks, maybe say hi during lunch. At the end of the day, they go home. They don't know what other teachers are teaching. They don't need to know. They don't care. They feel pretty good on their own. And again, this isn't a miserable place to work, but just no one's really reaching their potential. So don't confuse strong with effective. The next slide, here are the two things I want to get off my chest. These things are not true. Cultures do not change fast. Culture and climate are not the same thing. So let's go to cultures changing fast. Often we have seen or heard people talk about their culture changing fast, and one of those is by virtue of a new program change. For some reason, we have gotten a new program. We are so excited about this new program. Allows us to keep track of student progress, or for whatever reason, it has really changed the way we look at student data. Our culture is now one that is responsive to student needs. The culture didn't change. What happened is that we have changed a few routines and maybe a few rituals, but the culture's values and beliefs did not change. Now, it might way down the road if these new routines and rituals are pushed and we just keep doing them over and over and over. It might change a few things, but to change the culture, you're going to have to work on something for many years. It isn't a new program. Other people might think that a great leader can show up and change the culture. Now that Mrs. Jones is our new director, the teachers seem very friendly, the support staff are helpful, and the students are excited about coming. With this new culture shift, teachers are happy to come to school now. Well, you know, a new director, teacher, principal, leader, they can probably make people happy, especially if they have this bubbly personality, if they're an extrovert, if they have a lot of charisma. They can get people to want to come to school for a while. But they're not going to change people's values and beliefs overnight. They're going to change the routines. They're going to change the climate. But they aren't going to change the culture. That, again, I apologize if I keep saying this too much, but it's going to take a few years. The last example is the weak leader culture change. With all the new rules, our new principal, Mr. Smith, has imposed, it would be difficult to experiment with new teaching methods. It is difficult to be effective with this new culture of efficiency leaning on us. And a weak leader cannot change the culture that quick. Now, if it's a weak culture, it can be changed quicker than if it's a strong culture. And our research has found that a weak leader can change a culture faster than a good leader can. It's easier to make a school worse than it is to make it better. I'm not going to get into the philosophy behind that statement, but there are many researchers out there who agree this to be true. And a little something, a new culture of efficiency. I'm off script now, but the culture of efficiency, that just doesn't make sense to me. The culture of efficiency sounds like breakfast of eggs. You only have one culture. So if you're going to say you have a culture of efficiency, then that's why we're here. That's what we're worshiping, and nothing else matters. So please be careful when you see or hear somebody say culture of something. It sounds like there's many cultures out there, and there's really just one. So culture's changing fast, and the new program leader, great leader, weak leader, please understand that something's changing. It's just not the culture. As I go to the next slide, you can see a lot of information about shaping a new school culture. This was in our book, School Culture Rewired. And the second book, School Culture Recharged, added where you see culture shaping people, people shaping culture. In our first book, we were under the impression, or I think we let people know what culture was, and it's this. It almost came across as the scary monster under the bed that you shouldn't kick. And so School Culture Recharged was giving people confidence, giving leaders confidence that yes, they can mess with the culture. In fact, you can use it as an ally. So not only can people improve the culture, but we can use the culture to improve people. If you have a school with good people in it, it will attract good people. And what's also cool about that, if you have a school culture that's full of and attracting good teachers, it scares the bad ones away. The word on the street gets out there that there's high expectations and people work hard and they care, and those people who don't want to work hard, who don't really care about kids, don't bother applying. Let's move on to my next thing that's not true, culture and climate being the same thing. As I look at the slide with the iceberg, I'll just be honest with you. I'm sorry if this hurts anyone's feelings. I'm getting a little tired of this image myself because it's one thing. You can see the top part and there's a lot more underneath. The climate's what you can see, the culture's all the stuff hidden underneath. And while it's a useful image to a point, it also suggests that climate and culture are the same thing, one iceberg. And so I think that might be something that I'm fighting in some of my efforts. On the next slide, you'll see it's actually a conversation. I like to think of climate and culture as two concepts, two constructs that talk to each other. And they aren't the same thing. So as we look at the next slide to where we have the differences between climate and culture listed, I would like to spend just a little bit of time talking about that with some of my favorites, if you will. Quickly, climate is the group's attitude, where culture is the group's personality. And climate, well, attitude's so much easier to change. When you think about it, if a student comes to your office, which is easier to change, their attitude or their personality? And so culture is not a child, it's an adult. Imagine trying to change the personality of an adult. What energy would you have to use? What resources? How long would that take? And now you begin to realize that you just can't do that over a course of a few weeks or even a few months. Climate's the difference between Mondays and Fridays. In most schools, we find that Mondays are just a little bit different from Fridays in many aspects, but it's usually in the energy level and what we're talking about. Typically, in many schools, when you walk in on Monday morning, you are supposed to drag your feet, maybe talk about the weekend, but you're a little bit tired, you're a little wore out, got your coffee cup, your eyes aren't quite open yet. And it's usually not until Wednesday do you start getting energy because you can see Friday coming. And then once Friday's here, we can be happy. So Mondays are miserable, Fridays are fun, and that's climate. The reason it's that way is because the culture gives climate permission to be miserable on Mondays. And the culture gives school climate permission to have fun on Fridays. I mean, it's the business model we've adopted. People a while back thought that school was a business. And you see in corporate America how they have their hump day and their countdown to the weekend, and thank God it's Friday. And so at schools, we tend to do that too. We might even have teachers who have numbers on the board counting down to the next holiday or the end of school. All this is kind of good-natured, but in a way, it might be whispering in the students' ears that you shouldn't want to be here, that school is a dreadful place, and that living for the weekend is what we're all about. And again, not just culture telling us that. There are many cultures out there, if you will, or societies in this world. They have no idea what day of the week it is. And there's plenty of retired people who couldn't care less if it's Monday or Friday. It's just something we do in schools. Climate creates a state of mind, and culture provides for a limited way of thinking. Climate's easy to change. I could come into any school and change the climate very, very quickly. It would just be a matter of me pulling a fire alarm. Can you imagine your school? If I came in and pulled the fire alarm unannounced, the students would be kind of giddy. They'd be smiling. They'd be getting up. They get to go outside, maybe visit with their friends. They get out of the classroom. Teacher's probably a little upset, especially if you haven't warned them, that we had just changed the climate in your building inside of a minute. And culture won't change that quickly. It's based on values and beliefs. It takes many years to evolve. Another analogy I like to use is climate is the fever and culture is the immune system. In other words, think of your body when a virus shows up. It will start making you uncomfortable. It's letting you know something's wrong. You need to slow down. You need to take care of yourself. So you get a fever. Well, culture and climate are the same way. Culture is your immune system. And when a change or something different is starting to show up on the horizon, then it will make you uncomfortable. It will give you a fever, if you will. And that's climate. People will begin feeling uncomfortable whenever a change. So change must be the virus. Culture is the immune system. Climate is the fever. And you know, if you get a fever, maybe you can take aspirin and you feel great for a while, or at least better, but you're still sick. Just like in schools, if the climate stinks, maybe we can bring donuts or wear jeans on Fridays, but there's still something wrong. You haven't fixed anything. Climate surrounds us. Culture is part of us. It's our DNA. Climate's the way we feel around here. Culture is the way we do things around here. And that might be one of the best explanations I can give you, is that when you think about driving, there's speed limits. And the speed limit isn't the average speed you should drive. It's supposed to be the maximum. And if you go around some highways, especially city highways that go through cities, the speed limit's 55, but a lot of people are going faster. I mean, about 65 or 70, especially during a rush hour. So while the written rule might be 55, the unwritten rule might be 65. So that's the way we do things around here. This is how fast we go. I know that there's a student handbook. I know there's a discipline code. There's a board policy. Might even have a teacher handbook. That's the speed limit. But new teachers want to know how fast are we really going around here. So understand that first time when the teacher shows up, they are looking for a veteran teacher to find out, when do we really send someone to the office? What does professional dress really mean? What time should I get to work? When can we leave? Where am I supposed to sit during assemblies, and where can I eat lunch? A lot of these things might be written down, but there's an unwritten rule. And climate, again, is the way we feel around here, but it's more how we're supposed to feel around here. You might have some Monday mornings where you come in feeling great, but it won't take long for someone to cross their arms and roll their eyes at your good mood on a Monday morning for you to realize that you need to calm down just a little bit so you can fit in. That's all. So you don't make any of the rest of us look bad. Climate's the first thing that changes when positive or negative change is made. In other words, it determines when something's going wrong, or going right, the climate changes. Now, what is interesting about climate is that if it continues to go wrong or right, over time, it will become part of the culture, and people won't notice it anymore. And I say that because in many situations, in many negative situations, school educators don't even realize it is a negative situation because it has been around for so long. It has redefined what normal is, and that's just who they are. The next slide, climate is in your head, and so is culture. So that's what a big thing they have in common. Everything else that you see out there are footprints, and I'll get into those footprints in just a little bit. But climate and culture are in your head, and the only way they can get into your head is through a story. I mentioned that earlier. So you can't start a climate, you can't change a climate with numbers. It needs to happen with a story. So even if you show people a spreadsheet or a table with numbers or any kind of data out there, that's fine, but that's not the story. And if you don't put a story to those numbers, somebody will. And that's what perpetuates a culture. It's the stories that we put to what's happening out there. It's what's happened in the past and how can we make meaning out of that. Well, when I talk about culture and climate being in your head, so is your vision. So if we ask people to think about the future, and that's what I mean by vision, think about the future 5 years from now. What do you want the school to look like? Well, think about the school 5 years ago. Did we have these same conversations? Who won? Which vision happened? Because if I walk through many schools, they still look like they did 5, 10, maybe 20 years ago. And that's the culture winning. That's the culture getting its way. It's the culture saying it worked in the past, it will work in the future. So tables in the rows, lecture from the front of the room, test on Friday, so many of the things that we do in classrooms now that reflect what we did 30, 40, 50 years ago. That's simply the culture reassuring us that you're doing the right thing. On the next slide, you find the elements of organizational culture. I have 12 elements listed there, and buried among them, you'll find climate. So again, as we talk about and look at the differences and similarities between climate and culture, understand that climate is just one of many footprints. Many of them. This, by the way, is a fun activity to do. If you ever get the opportunity when you're working with the adults in your building, and not just the teachers, but maybe the teacher's age, get the counselor in there. And if you have some support staff who have been there a really long time, I would invite them to go ahead and join in some of these conversations. What kind of school do you have? What is the vision? Why do people stay at this school? What are some of the rituals and ceremonies? What are the symbols we look at every day but we don't see? Chances are in the building you walk past the same thing day after day after day, and now you just don't see it anymore. Who are the heroes of the past? What are the way we do things around here? But more importantly, if you're a leader in your building, what are the stories, the myths being passed on to rookies? How does the culture get into the new people's heads? Because the next slide shows us that people value ideas from their friends more than the ideas. If you look at the next slide, culture gets into your head through stories. Stories give meaning to what happened. Stories outweigh data when influencing behaviors. Let me share with you what I'm really trying to say here. Imagine that it's around the first day that teachers have to come back. It's probably in August. I apologize to those of you who have a balanced calendar, and it's probably a little bit more complex. but your new teacher just showed up. They're in their room. They're getting it ready. A few veteran teachers are out walking around the building to meet the new teachers. They're looking for friends, the new teacher, and the veteran teachers are recruiting. So imagine, if you will, that new teacher sitting at their desk, working on the computer, or maybe putting things up on the walls, organizing the desks, and a veteran teacher stops at the door and says, "Hey, how you doing? Glad to have you with us. Want to eat lunch sometime? You know, I'm not doing anything now. Why don't you come on? I'll take you to one of the better restaurants here in town." You know, what's a new teacher going to say? No. And it turns into a difficult situation. And what makes it worse is if this teacher, this veteran teacher, is not one of your better teachers. Now we have one of your less effective teachers inducting or showing your new teacher how we do things around here, how we really dress, who you can trust. When do you send someone to the office, and does the principal really do anything? What do you do when a parent shows up? When do you call parents? Do I really have to come to any of these extracurricular activities? And it goes on, and pretty soon the new teacher comes back thinking, okay, this is normal. To prevent that sort of thing, I've seen where principals, even at the interview, before they've hired this person, they've asked them, would you be willing to have lunch with one of my other teachers before you come to the building? In other words, we're going to make sure that the first interactions that my new teacher have are with the best teachers I have in the building. And they will tell these stories of the past where we have been successful. And that teacher will want to be there. They'll figure out what they're supposed to be doing. They'll learn the unwritten rules. So from the next slide, how people change from the better? Well, they make a friend, and the friend says, we can do better. Let's try this. Hey, it worked. When we hear this from a friend, we tend to believe it. When we hear it from a principal or a superintendent, we're not sure if we're being sold something. We're trying to be convinced as much as when it comes from our friend. And again, this is through the lens of organizational culture. And remember, our culture tells us who we can talk to about what. And so if our best friend, who we believe and value and hang out with the most, if they tell us something, we tend to believe it. So if we look at the next slide, this is how people might change for the worse. That's a friend will come up, maybe right after a professional development activity, and say, you know, we're good enough. Let's not try this. And maybe after a while they might say, you see, it didn't work. Again, this friend isn't trying to be harmful. They don't think they're being mean. They think they are protecting the school and the teachers. And that's typically what negative teachers are. These are passionate people who still care about the school and the students, but they just don't want to fit in. They don't like the direction the new school is going. Now, the toxic ones you got to get rid of, because they're the ones who hate everybody all the time and we wish they never showed up. The negative ones, we just need to rechannel their passion. So whatever we hear from our friends, that's what we tend to believe. It's that peer pressure thing. It's that culture managing the conversations. That's what really this is all about. When you think about school culture and trying to improve a school, we're basically talking about the conversations adults have in the building. If you ever get a chance to go to another school, listen to how the adults talk to each other. That is more important than any decorations you might find. If it's freshly painted, are there flowers out front, are there cute banners hanging? Listen to how the adults talk to each other. That's the greatest clue we can have as to whether or not that's a good school. After we move on from the difference between climate and culture, a good way to notice the role of climate relative to culture is when we look at the elements of organizational culture. Here I have 12 elements of organizational culture on this slide, and you'll find climate embedded within those 12. It's not any bigger, it's not any smaller. It is just one of many footprints of how we can determine what kind of culture we have. And this is an activity that's fun to do with staff in your building. Especially the school teachers and any veteran support staff who have been there for a long period of time, and 3 to 5 years at least. This is not something for teachers, for parents or students or the community. I don't believe they would be as informed, but have these try this activity sometime. Why do people stay at your school? What gets them out of bed? What symbols are there in your building that you just don't see anymore? What stories are being told about who the heroes are of the past? What mood are you supposed to be in, especially given a particular topic? Just throw out something like faculty meetings or parent phone calls or bus parking lot, and just see what kind of mood are you supposed to be in when that's the topic. Norms are the way we do things around here, and there might be some really quirky things that have nothing to do with student achievement that you do at your school, and that's fine. We never are trying to change the whole culture, but it's an interesting conversation. And the stories, that's really important, because that's, again, how culture gets into our heads. How does the new teacher learn to fit in? Because that is so important to a new teacher, to be validated by the veteran teachers on staff. And in August, when that new teacher's getting their room ready, they're all by themselves in the summertime, there's a good chance that there will be some veteran teachers walking around looking for friends, looking to say hi. And imagine, if you will, one of those veteran teachers stops at the doorway of the new teacher and says, "Hi, welcome to the school. We're glad you're here. Hope everything's going well. Let me know if I could help you of any opportunities that you have, any questions you might have. Oh, hey, do you want to go do lunch? There's this really cool place here in town that's got really good food." It would be difficult for any new teacher to say no. The problem is, what if that's not one of your better teachers? What if that's one of your toxic or negative teachers in your building who has decided now they are going to be the first voice your new teacher hears about how we do things around here? In other words, what is professional dress? When do we really show up to work, and when can we leave? Are we really supposed to send kids to the office? Does the principal really do anything? A lot of things, where do I eat lunch? A lot of questions that might not be in a handbook anywhere. New teachers want to find out so that they can quickly fit in and feel like part of the family. Now, a good principal will understand that this could possibly happen. And we're not going to wait for the first day of school for the teachers to come back. We aren't going to wait for this first day for students to come back. We might even initiate something at the interview. Before you've even hired this teacher, we might suggest that they have lunch with one of your better teachers. And you might even ask that better teacher, one of your best effective teachers in the building, would you mind stopping by and taking this person to lunch, or at least having a quick conversation with them? They need to be your friend. Because if you look at the next slide, people will value ideas from their friends more than the ideas. In other words, culture gets into your head through stories. Stories give meaning to what happened. Stories outweigh data when influencing behaviors. and it needs to be stories from a friend. Now, leaders can tell stories. The principal, the superintendent can tell a story, but please understand that it might come across as if they're trying to convince or sell something. Whereas if it's a friend telling a story, we tend to believe it, and it tends to influence our behaviors. So how people might change for the better. If our friend says, we can do better, let's try this, hey, it worked. If that comes from one of those professional peers who we hang around with and value, then chances are we will try to do better. We will try new things. However, people can change for the worse if their friend comes up to them. And if you could imagine it right after a professional development opportunity, either in the hallway or in the parking lot, the friend kind of walks up and rolls her eyes and says, you know, we're good enough. We don't need to try this. Or after a period of time, they say, see, it didn't work. That is going to resonate. That is going to stick in that teacher's mind a lot better than anything they heard during the professional development presentation. That's why we're looking at the lens of culture to improve schools. Remember, culture manages relationships. It determines who can talk to who about what. So if we look through the lens of school culture to improve schools, we need to be aware of their relationships, know who can talk to who about what, let your best teachers be the ones out there doing the talking, telling the stories. So I guess at this time I can go ahead and take some questions or any additional thoughts, or if I can add meaning to anything that I've said.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, we've had a few questions come in. The first one is, what tips do you have for building principals who are often the most isolated and possibly not even aware of the cultural currents in their school?
Well, one thing that I have found is that, yes, it is, especially in the larger settings, it is very difficult for a principal to have their finger on the pulse of every piece of the building. But if you had to pick one, it would probably be the component of your best teachers. And chances are they know who they are, and they're already hanging out together. They already might have their own clique, if you will. And to be a part of that interaction is probably time well spent.
Wonderful. Another story's come in, another question. In the hiring process, how do you find the right person who will help grow a healthy culture?
You know, that's a good question, because you're always rolling the dice, and many people are good at interviewing. But chances are a good teacher will come to a good school if there are already good teachers there. In other words, good teachers are the best recruiters for good teachers. And I have seen this many times, to where principals who are either interviewing or going to career fairs, they take their best teachers with them to do the sales pitch. They want other teachers to see what they're all about, and they know the language, they know how to recruit better teachers, and they probably can recognize the fakes.
What a great idea that is. Another question, in terms of the generational gap, you know, there's between all the different ones, how would you suggest we bridge the generational gap in terms of different beliefs and backgrounds and what's valued, expected, etc.?
Yeah, and that's a question that you find in any kind of a gap. Sometimes we have gaps between what the union of a school says and what the school leaders want to happen, or sometimes it's generational, sometimes it's racial, sometimes it's ethnic. And we have built an activity that is Todd and I, and we call it the purpose of education. And what we have is listed 19 things that we believe are potential purposes of education. In other words, why we built these schools and make students come to the school. And what we challenge people to do is to go through these 19 items and rate them as to whether they're important or not. And then at the end of this, we come together as a group and compare what we have, what we've said. And what we usually find is that a lot of people are in agreement. It's not that there's a magic top 5 for everywhere you go, but the idea is that we're all on the same page more often than not. And then that starts the conversation that might shorten that gap just a little bit, that we are trying to get the same thing done.
Good idea. Here's one. What strategies would you suggest in terms of minimizing the voice of the outlier and maximizing the whole? I guess that's the smartest person in the room.
That's interesting because, Todd, I'm going to steal some information from what Todd Whitaker has written. And we have it in our book, and we have it in the second book also. And what we suggest is that you actually begin to create a subculture of your best teachers. Typically, the culture you have now is a subculture of the past. It just came to power over time. And the culture you want in the future probably ought to be a subculture you're working on now. And there's nothing wrong with that subculture being composed of your best teachers. When it comes to the negative teachers, if you do have a subculture or a clique of negative teachers, let's say you have 4 teachers in the building that just drive you nuts and they're always hanging around together and they're just a group of misfits, if you will. What you're wanting to do is to get that group from 4 to 3 and try to find who is the weakest member of that group, who is the least committed. And you as a leader, go find someone who's a really good teacher and ask them to engage that person in conversations about the future, about what is the mission, why are we here. And I don't mean in an interrogative way. I mean in an informal way in the hallways with a smile and a handshake and maybe even lunch, just to begin to recruit them out of the negative group and into the positive group. So if you can get it from 4 to 3, 3 to 2, 2 to 1, if there's just one out there, you can't have a negative culture with just one person.
Wow, excellent. Last question here. How would you suggest we support our high achievers who might feel dumped on because they are so skilled in many areas?
Yeah, that's interesting. If you want to get something done, ask a busy person. And that reminds me, you know, we're wanting to get our house remodeled here, and all the good people are busy. And our architect said, you know, if you call someone, they said, great, we can start next week, don't hire them. I think what you want to do is be sure that your best teachers know they are your best teachers, yeah, and then work from there.
That's wonderful advice. Well, we are so appreciative of your time and your talent and sharing so many good ideas. I think a lot of best practices came away from this session. We look forward to perhaps engaging you again. Steve, thank you again for sharing your thoughts. And this session is being recorded, and for those of you that want to hear it again and again and ponder this, we hope that you will reflect on this webinar today. Any last thoughts, Steve?
Oh, no, please. I enjoyed it, and if anybody wants to email me or call me, please feel free, and we can continue some discussions. I love this stuff. Yeah, thank you. Again, Steve's email is right here on the screen. Please feel free to tweet him or email him with all your questions. So with that, we will end this webinar. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Steve.